Greetings, folks. In this episode of World of Lies, we're going to have a look at the Dulles brothers. And as we can see here, they were both in office at the same time under the presidency of Ike Eisenhower. And that's pretty extraordinary, as it's the first and only time in U.S. history that two brothers held these positions, where one brother was in charge of overt foreign relations with other countries, while the other brother was in charge of covert operations in foreign countries. And yet if you say the name Dulles to someone today, the chances are they probably don't know who you're talking about, or they might think that you're talking about the airport in Washington, D.C. I find that more people know more about the airport than about the man that it was named after. And here's a little interesting side note. When the airport was opened on November 17, 1962, by President Kennedy and the former President Ike Eisenhower, with John Foster Dulles' widow, Janet Avery Dulles, on hand as well. President Kennedy didn't actually want to name the airport after John Foster Dulles, but at the persistence of Ike Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles' brother Allen Dulles and others, JFK relented, and there they are, unveiling a bust of John Foster Dulles at the center of the terminal. Now let's take a deep dive into the lives of John Foster Dulles and his brother Allen Welsh Dulles. And looking at the family tree, we see their parents were Allen Macy Dulles and Edith Foster Dulles. And Edith Foster Dulles is sisters with Eleanor Foster Lansing, who's married to the Secretary of State, Robert Lansing. And if you'll remember, we saw him in Part 1, Chapter 6 of this series, The Lies of the Lusitania. And we saw that he was a total war hawk that helped push America into the war based on a bunch of lies. And the two sisters, Edith and Eleanor Foster, are the daughters of John Watson Foster and Mary Park McPherson Foster. And notice John Watson Foster was Secretary of State. So how about that? This thing seems to run in the family. So naturally the grandson and the nephew of two former Secretaries of State would himself go on to become Secretary of State, while his brother would become CIA Director. They also had three sisters, with Eleanor Lansing Dulles having a 20-year career in the State Department, while Margaret and Adeline were famously running around in the socialite circles. And both brothers were also married. And here's another family relation that's pretty interesting. When you look at the family tree going up from their father, Allen Macy Dulles, we follow the chain all the way up to Joseph Maris and Anne Shipley, who were born in 1715 and 1720, respectively. And that's long before there was a United States, or a DuPont Empire, or even toilet paper. And when we follow the descendants of their daughter, we see their great-great-grandson is Buffalo Bill Cody, who's third cousins 2 times removed from the Dulles brothers. And now let's have a look at their grandfather, John Watson Foster, who was Secretary of State from 1892 to 1893. And despite having the position for only 1 year, he was actually quite a powerful Washington figure. And he had an adventurous life that's somewhat similar to what we saw in Smedley Butler. And we'll begin his story going back to Evansville, Indiana, in January of 1860. And we can see he bought a plot of land in Vanderburgh County from Charles Farr. And remember this newspaper, the Evansville Journal, as we'll see it a few times coming up. The next year, in June of 1861, we can see he set up his law practice in Evansville, Indiana. But now with the Civil War having just begun, John Foster would join the Union forces, or the North. And we can see that in August of 1862, he was a lieutenant colonel leading forces in battle in Kentucky. And in October of 1862, we can see he was promoted from lieutenant colonel of the 28th Regiment to colonel of the 65th Regiment. In December of 1862, in the Evansville Journal again, we see a couple of letters written about John Foster praising his actions. And you can pause and read them for yourself, and they're quite complimentary and perhaps deservedly so. And just below we see a letter from John Foster writing back to them and thanking them. In September of 1863, we see Colonel John W. Foster of the 65th Indiana telegraphs here to his friends that he took possession of Knoxville, Tennessee on the 4th with his brigade, and adds that the rejoicing of the people was unbounded. A year after the Civil War had ended, back in Evansville, Indiana, on June 30th, 1866, we see that John W. Foster has bought the Evansville Journal, and he actually bought 1/3 of the controlling interests. So on top of having a law practice and being a war hero, he can now add newspaper mogul to his list of credentials as well. Now we fast forward to May of 1873, and we see John W. Foster is going to be the U.S. Minister to Mexico. At the beginning of 1880, John W. Foster is going to be an envoy extraordinary and a minister plenipotentiary to Russia. Next, a couple of years later, in February of 1883, we see John W. Foster would become the U.S. Minister to Spain. So lawyer, war hero, newspaperman, minister to Mexico, minister to Russia, and now minister to Spain. This guy's having quite the career. We see a couple of days later that President Chester A. Arthur requested John W. Foster's presence at the White House. Foster would remain as minister to Spain until 1885, and then he would return back to Indiana and into his private life again. Until the beginning of November 1887, when he went on some sort of mission to Mexico City for the U.S. government that he didn't want to talk about. And in this I'm reminded of Smedley Butler's secret mission to Mexico City, 27 years later. Though I doubt John W. Foster's mission was as harrowing or dangerous as what Smedley Butler went through. In late 1891, rumors were swirling that John Foster might become the next Secretary of State. And that wouldn't quite happen just yet. But due to poor health and family issues, current Secretary of State James Blaine would retire in June of 1892, and John W. Foster would then become Secretary of State. And then he would become involved in a scandal that foreshadows multiple events to come in the following decades for the U.S. Marines and Smedley Butler, and I guess you could say would also evolve into a family specialty. And that's the overthrow or removal of the rightful rulers of a country to install leaders who are Wall Street approved. And in this case, we're going to look at what happened to the Kingdom of Hawaii in 1893. On September 14, 1892, the U.S. Minister to the Kingdom of Hawaii, John Stevens, wrote to U.S. Secretary of State John Foster, telling him about the deadlock between the Queen and the legislature in Hawaii. To give you some backstory, Queen Liliuokalani was only on the throne for about a year and a half up to this point. Foreign nationals, the rich, and the sugar interests were already in control. And that's thanks to the Constitution of the Hawaiian Islands signed by His Majesty King Kalakaua in 1887. This stripped away most of the power of the monarchy and reduced King Kalakaua to a mere figurehead, and more aptly a puppet for the rich. And it also stripped away a lot of the rights of the native Hawaiian population as well. And it also earned the nickname the Bayonet Constitution, as King Kalakaua was forced to sign it by the rich who had the backing of the military. King Kalakaua would die not long after on January 20th, 1891, and his sister, Liliuokalani, would become queen, and she vowed to make changes, and did, which of course the rich didn't like very much. And here we are. In that same September 1892 letter to John Foster, John Stevens also writes that the U.S.S. Boston is in the harbor, and Captain Wiltse will cooperate. Now we fast forward a few months to January of 1893, and because at this time it takes 10 days for news to travel to the mainland, we find out that on January 17th there was a revolution in Hawaii. The Queen was dethroned and a provisional government was established, and this was done by what was called a Committee of Safety. Secretary of State Foster received this morning advices from the Hawaiian Islands to the effect that the monarchy has been overthrown and a provisional government established in the interests of the whole people of the islands. And that's not true in the slightest, as the provisional government was set up for the interests of the rich. It was the Committee of Safety who appointed the provisional government, with several members of the Committee of Safety as part of it. And of the 13 members of the rich and elite who made up the Committee of Safety, only 4 of them were Hawaiian nationals, with the other 9 being foreign nationals, and 5 of them were American citizens, of course. These guys were the rich elites behind the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani, but they couldn't do it alone, and they certainly had help. The day after the overthrow, on January 18, 1893, John Stevens would send a telegram to John Foster via San Francisco, which would arrive on January 28th, and then be relayed across to Washington the same day. And he tells Foster that things in Hawaii are moving rapidly, and that the overthrow was done without the loss of life, and then goes on about the new government a bit. On the same day, January 18th, Stevens sent Foster another lengthy telegram as well, but for some reason doesn't get received until February 3rd. And in it, he sends a copy of the orders that he sent to Captain Wiltse of the U.S.S. Boston on January 16th, which is the day before the overthrow. And in it we can see he wrote to Captain Wiltse, "I request you to land Marines and sailors from the ship under your command for the protection of the United States Legation and United States Consulate, and to secure the safety of American life and property." After receiving the first message, John Foster writes back to Stevens on January 28th, telling him, "You will continue to recognize the new government under such conditions, and you will keep in constant communication with the commander of the United States Naval Force at Honolulu, with a view to acting if need be for the protection of the interests and property of American citizens, and aiding in the preservation of good order under the changed condition reported." So in other words, he's telling him to support the new provisional government. 2 weeks later, on February 15, 1893, U.S. President Benjamin Harrison would send a message to the United States Senate, in which he states, "I transmit herewith, with a view to its ratification, a treaty of annexation concluded on the 14th day of February, 1893, between Honorable John W. Foster, Secretary of State, who was duly empowered to act in that behalf on the part of the United States, and Lauren A. Thurston, W.R. Castle, W.C. Wilder, C.L. Carter, and Joseph Marsden, the commissioners on the part of the provisional government of the Hawaiian Islands." And 4 of those guys also happen to be on the Committee of Safety, with 3 of them also being part of the provisional government. President Harrison would also state, "The overthrow of the monarchy was not in any way promoted by this government," meaning the United States. But that's not true, as we'll see. Following President Harrison's message to the Senate, Secretary of State John W. Foster would also send a message. And in it he would state, "At the time the provisional government took possession of the government buildings, no troops or officers of the United States were present or took any part whatever in the proceedings." And again, as we'll see, that's not true. So with the overthrow of Hawaii's Queen Liliuokalani complete, President Harrison and Secretary of State Foster are trying to get the annexation deal that they reached with the provisional government ratified by the U.S. Senate. But look at the date, February 15th, 1893. In less than 3 weeks' time, President Grover Cleveland is going to be inaugurated for his second presidency. And he was well versed in what was going on in Hawaii for the years leading up to the overthrow, as he was also president from 1885 to 1889. And we can see here, within a week after his inauguration, he sent to the Senate a curt message of 5 lines. Quote, "For the purpose of re-examination, I withdraw the treaty of annexation between the United States and the Provisional Government of the Hawaiian Islands, now pending in the Senate, which was signed on February 14, 1893, and transmitted to the Senate on the 15th of the same month, and I therefore request that said treaty be returned to me. Grover Cleveland." End quote. He appointed longtime Congressman James Blount to lead an investigation. And on December 18, 1893, President Grover Cleveland would deliver his own president's message relating to the Hawaiian Islands. And he makes quite a few scathing statements, such as, "On the 16th day of January, 1893, between 4 and 5 o'clock in the afternoon, a detachment of Marines from the United States steamer Boston with 2 pieces of artillery landed at Honolulu. The men, upwards of 160 in all, were supplied with double cartridge belts filled with ammunition, and with haversacks and canteens, and were accompanied by a hospital corps with stretchers and medical supplies. This military demonstration upon the soil of Honolulu was of itself an act of war." President Grover Cleveland would also state, "By an act of war committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States, and without authority of Congress, the government of a feeble but friendly and confiding people has been overthrown." And President Grover Cleveland goes on to say, in Foster's communication of February 15th to the President, and he highlights the letter that we looked at earlier, where Foster stated that no troops or officers of the United States were present or took any part whatever in the proceedings, and so on. And President Cleveland says, "These statements are utterly at variance with the evidence." So President Grover Cleveland totally shot down the annexation plans of all these guys and called it an act of war. And to get a good idea of exactly what happened, we'll look at the statements of Charles Wilson, who, as Marshal of the Kingdom of Hawaii at the time, was in the best position to see what was going on both sides. And he says that on Sunday the 15th of January, he received information that there was a meeting being held at Lauren Thurston's house, and that the Committee of Safety were present. And the Committee of Safety was only formed the day before by Lauren A. Thurston, who's actually the one behind everything going on with the overthrow. And the object of the meeting was to overthrow the Queen by force. At this meeting, Thurston stated that Minister Stevens had promised to support them if they proclaimed a provisional government with troops from the O.S.S. Boston, and that their cause could not be a success without those troops and Minister Stevens' assistance. Charles Wilson says he proposed to put out warrants for the ringleaders of the overthrow, but the Attorney General objected, citing a few reasons. And ultimately, Peterson also said that the arrest of these parties would precipitate a conflict with the United States troops, which by this point was probably true. And Charles Wilson says that he pointed out that they had more than enough men and equipment to fend off any of the forces the O.S.S. Boston could land. And after receiving some more information, he again proposed that the ringleaders should be arrested. And again the Attorney General and the Queen's lawyer objected, saying it would precipitate a conflict with the U.S. troops, as Minister Stevens had already declared himself. Charles Wilson then says, "At about 4 p.m. I saw posters being put up, which the conspirators had drawn up and had printed that day, calling for a mass meeting on Monday afternoon and signed Committee of Safety." The following Monday, the 16th, I received information that the Committee of Safety were to meet at Thurston's office. At 10 a.m., a committee from the conspirators had a meeting with the Cabinet in the Foreign Office. The meeting seemed to have been safety valves for letting loose whatever excess of feeling there may have been in the popular mind, for by 4 p.m., it seemed as if the dissatisfaction was all over, as there was scarcely anyone to be seen on the streets. It was like a calm after the storm. About 4:30 p.m., I got information that the Boston's men were ordered to land. About 4:40 p.m., the signal was given that the boats were being got ready on board the Boston, and that the artillery and the Gatling guns were being put onto the boats. Also, the men were armed with small arms. At a little before 5 o'clock, they were landed at the regular landing near Brewer and Company's in Charleston's Wharf. A little after 5 p.m., the American forces marched from the boat landing along Queen Street and turned up Fort Street and halted at the corner of Merchant and Fort Streets, 2 doors off of which is the United States Consulate. A company of bluejackets were ordered to the United States Legation, and the remaining companies were marched up Merchant Street into Palace Square, thence along King Street between the Palace and the Government buildings, and were halted in front of Mr. Hopper's residence on the south corner of the Palace enclosure, in full view of Her Majesty the Queen, about 200 yards away from the Palace and the Government buildings. This wrongful recognition by our minister placed the government of the Queen in a position of most perilous perplexity, and the minister he is referring to there is John Stevens. She knew that she could not withstand the power of the United States, but she believed that she might safely trust to its justice. She surrendered to the superior force of the United States, whose minister had caused the United States troops to be landed at Honolulu, and declared that he would support the provisional government. And when he says the superior force of the United States, he means the United States as a whole, not just the troops from the O.S.S. Boston. And that's how the Kingdom of Hawaii was overthrown in a bloodless coup. And although President Grover Cleveland wanted to see Queen Liliuokalani reinstated, he knew he couldn't do so without force. But considering the overthrow was done without the loss of life, force wasn't an option for him. And the provisional government would rule for a little over a year, until the Republic of Hawaii was created. But then in 1898, with the start of the Spanish-American War, which entailed the Philippines as well, President William McKinley would annex Hawaii. And as we saw in Part 2, Chapter 2 of this series, the 1898 Spanish-American War is when Smedley Butler begins his career. At the first session of the 103rd Congress of the United States on January 5, 1993, the United States officially acknowledged the 100th anniversary of the January 17, 1893 overthrow of the Kingdom of Hawaii, and offered an apology to Native Hawaiians. And in the resolution we see, whereas on January 14, 1893, John L. Stevens, hereafter referred to in this resolution as the United States Minister, conspired with a small group of non-Hawaiian residents of the Kingdom of Hawaii, including citizens of the United States, to overthrow the indigenous and lawful government of Hawaii. The United States Minister and the naval representatives of the United States caused armed naval forces of the United States to invade the sovereign Hawaiian nation on January 16, 1893, and to position themselves near the Hawaiian government buildings and the Iolani Palace, to intimidate Queen Liliuokalani and her government. Whereas on the afternoon of January 17, 1893, a Committee of Safety deposed the Hawaiian Monarchy and proclaimed the establishment of a provisional government. Whereas the United States Minister thereupon extended diplomatic recognition to the provisional government. And they're talking about John Stevens there. But remember, it was only 11 days after that, on January 28, 1893, that Secretary of State John Foster would tell John Stevens in a telegram, "You will continue to recognize the new government under such conditions." But interestingly enough, in this 1993 resolution, you'll not find Secretary of State John W. Foster's name anywhere, nor President Benjamin Harrison's name. They lay all the blame at Minister John Stevens and the Committee of Safety members, who are indeed mostly responsible for everything. But as we've seen immediately after the fact, they did have the support of the Secretary of State John Foster and President Benjamin Harrison as well. The resolution does mention President Grover Cleveland, though, and what he did. Whereas in a message to Congress on December 18, 1893, President Grover Cleveland reported fully and accurately on the illegal acts of the conspirators, described such acts as an act of war, committed with the participation of a diplomatic representative of the United States, and without authority of Congress. After U.S. President Benjamin Harrison and Secretary of State John W. Foster made their false statements to the U.S. Senate on February 15, 1893, in their attempted illegal annexation of Hawaii. We see in the news exactly 1 week later, on February 22, 1893, that Secretary of State John W. Foster is going to retire from President Harrison's cabinet the following day. And what he's going to do is assume the active directorship and management of the case of the United States in connection with the sealing industries of the Bering Sea, also known as the Bering Sea Arbitration or the First Seal Arbitration. And he's due to set sail for Southampton, England on the Saturday and then eventually get to Paris. His days were very numbered as Secretary of State, as President Grover Cleveland's administration was coming in on March the 4th. But there's a reason he chose this particular assignment. And we have to go back 2 years to January of 1890. And that's when John W. Foster's daughter, Eleanor Foster, would get married to Robert Lansing. And then when we have a look in the American Journal of International Law, 1914, they give us a brief description of Robert Lansing's career. And we can see in 1892, he was appointed Associate Counsel for the United States in the First Seal Arbitration. So he's already out there in Paris, and his father-in-law, John W. Foster, is now on his way. And remember, he's going to assume the overall directorship and management of the United States' case, and start grooming his son-in-law for eventual positions in the State Department. So that's a look at John Watson Foster, grandfather of John Foster Dulles and Ella Macy Dulles. And we had a small glimpse of their uncle, Robert Lansing. And again, you can see a little bit more of him in Part 2, Chapter 2 of this series. But now let's go have a look at the extraordinary lives of the Dulles brothers. And here's a rare photo of all 3 generations of Foster, Lansing, and Dulles in a family photo. And to get an idea of what their childhood was like, let's hear from Stephen Kinzer, who wrote the book, The Brothers.
They grew up in Watertown, New York, on the shores of Lake Ontario, which was kind of a playground for the New York rich. Their 2 greatest mentors as children were their uncle and their grandfather. They grew up in a parsonage. The father was a clergyman. The grandfather had been a clergyman and a missionary. The great-grandfather had been a clergyman and a missionary. So the atmosphere of missionary Calvinism permeated.
So their father, Ella Macy Dulles, and his father and grandfather were Presbyterian Calvinists, and that's how the 2 boys were raised.
I'm a parson's son, and I was brought up as a Presbyterian. Maybe as a Calvinist. Maybe that made me a fatalist.
And then, after they'd get up every morning in the summertime, take their cold shower, only kind their father would allow, and then rush down to the shore of Lake Ontario, where their grandfather and their uncle would be waiting to take them out in boats to stock the wily smallmouth bass. The Dulles brothers grew up in an atmosphere of privilege. Their grandfather, John Watson Foster, doted on them. And it wasn't enough for him to spend summers with them in Watertown. He wanted to bring them to Washington to live with him during the winter. And they came for many months and lived actually right here near DuPont Circle in John Watson Foster's house. At dinner, the other guests were Bernard Baruch, Grover Cleveland, Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft, Andrew Carnegie. These were the people they were having dinner with when they were 10 years old. Of course, they didn't participate in the discussions, but they were able to assimilate.
And there's a few familiar names we've seen already in this series. And the brothers weren't just raised in the world of the elites. Their family would rise to the status of celebrity, as we'll see. And we'll go back to 1902. And we see Allen Dulles making the newspapers for writing a history of the Boer War, and then his grandfather, John Watson Foster, would pay for 200 copies, and then they'd sell them for $100 each, donating the money to a relief fund. And keep in mind that back then, $100 was quite the amount of money. But of course that was the point, to raise money, and in its own way was a mechanism to get some of the elites to help chip in too. So overall, I think this was a pretty cool endeavor. Now if you look around, you can find hundreds of articles of the family year after year, usually in the social news or the society sections of newspapers. And I found the headline of this article rather interesting, because in today's lexicon, having a gay house party brings on a different meaning. Imagine today if you saw in the news a headline that said, Nancy Pelosi hosts gay house party. But of course back then the word gay was commonly used in place of the word happy. Here we see the family got together for Easter and sent out invitations for the following Monday to have tea with the family. Because clearly, that's very important for the public to know. So as you're starting to see, they're kind of like a Flintstone version of the Kardashians. Like how many other families got together for Easter and invited others over for tea as well, which is the main point in this short article. A great many, I would imagine, but I didn't read any of their stories in the newspapers. Here they write about John Watson Foster and his wife, who are going to leave Washington to attend grandson John Foster Dulles' graduation from Princeton, where he was named valedictorian. He was also the youngest of his class, so that's pretty impressive. In 1910, or 1911, but I think it was 1910, John Foster Dulles would start working at the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell. I couldn't find any contemporary records or references from the time period. But we can see here in this 1951 FBI investigation into Allen Dulles, which was a routine investigation being done because he was being hired by the CIA as a consultant. Longtime senior partner at Sullivan and Cromwell, Edward H. Green, stated that he was an associate of John Foster Dulles since 1910. And here's a newspaper article from the Corpus Christi Times from 1955 that the CIA had classified. And there's really nothing nefarious in the article, as it really just gives more of a biographical history of the Dulles brothers. And I suspect it was classified because of when it came out, 1955, right in the middle of both their tenures as CIA Director and Secretary of State. And in the article we can see, it was at Foster's recommendation that John Foster Dulles entered the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell in 1911. And I have no doubt that grandfather John Watson Foster played a role in his grandson John Foster Dulles' entrance into Sullivan and Cromwell. But I think it was probably 1910, as per Edward H. Green, senior partner of Sullivan and Cromwell. Anyways, that's not a big deal, but in a couple of years there would be a big deal. In June of 1912, when he would get married to Janet Avery, which of course brought a bunch of the family together. A couple of years later, in 1914, Allen Dulles would graduate from Princeton. And while he wasn't the valedictorian, he was awarded the special prizes in philosophy and ethics. And he was also named to the Special Honor Roll. Over the next year, Allen Dulles would travel the world. And we see in September of 1915, the Secretary of State and Mrs. Lansing have as a guest over Sunday Mr. Allen Dulles, the nephew of Mrs. Lansing, who has just returned from a trip around the world. He spent a year in India and stopped for some time in both China and Japan. And while he was overseas, he was sitting in a Paris sidewalk cafe when he read the news that Archduke Ferdinand was killed. Mr. Dulles has a host of friends in Washington, and was a frequent White House visitor when Mr. Robert Taft spent his school vacations there with his parents. And we haven't really touched on the Taft family in this series yet, but Robert Taft is the son of former U.S. President William Taft, who was the son of Alphonso Taft, who founded the Yale secret society, Skull and Bones, which the whole family would be part of. In April of 1916, we see 11 people pass examinations for diplomatic service, and of course one of them is Allen Dulles. And going back to the FBI file on Allen Dulles, we see he was appointed Secretary of the Legation on May 17, 1916, and assigned to Vienna, Austria. And remember, this is right in the middle of World War I. And although the United States wouldn't enter the war for another year, Allen Dulles was given the task of making contact with the dissident forces in Austria that were trying to upset the Austro-Hungarian wartime alliance with Germany, at least according to Allen Dulles' obituary in the New York Times. And taking a quick look at John Foster Dulles' obituary from 1959, again from the New York Times, we see this about his World War I service. Rejected for military service during World War I because of poor eyesight, Mr. Dulles got an Army commission as captain in the War Industries Board. So how about that? If you've been following this series right from the start, you might find that as a bit of a surprise. And if you haven't been following the series, you can see in Part 1, Chapter 9, Bernard Baruch and the Birth of the Military-Industrial Complex, a lot of information about the War Industries Board. And knowing John Foster Dulles was part of its junior ranks makes a lot of sense in what we're going to see going forward. On November 28, 1916, we see the Secretary of State and Mrs. Lansing were hosts at a brilliant dinner last evening at their residence. And among the foreign dignitaries they were hosting were the German ambassador Johann von Bernstorff and his wife. And we've seen him a few times in this series already, and looking at the time frame right now, again from Part 1, Chapter 9, this is just before he'd be involved in a scandal involving a whole host of important names, including Bernard Baruch. Anyways, amongst all those guests, we see Mrs. Allen Macy Dulles and her son, John Foster Dulles. On January 2nd, 1917, we see events of interest in and out of town, and Mrs. Robert Lansing is hosting a large luncheon, and Miss Natalie Dulles is spending the winter with her, as these are events of interest in and out of town. And down below we see Mrs. John Foster Dulles, Janet Avery, is going to spend a week at the Secretary of State in Mrs. Lansing's place. And the following month in February, across the Atlantic with the war raging on, we see the States is getting ready to pull their diplomats out. And that would include Allen Dulles. A week later, on March 6, 1917, with Allen Dulles on a ship on his way home, we see a bunch of the family have been invited to a buffet luncheon at the White House. Also in attendance is the U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, William McAdoo, and his daughter Nona. And we've seen him a few times in this series, and remember, as we saw in the Lies of the Lusitania, it was in McAdoo's Treasury Department that President Woodrow Wilson ordered the documents of the Lusitania, including the True Manifest, to be hidden from the world, not uncovered until President Roosevelt was in office. Just over a month later, on April 17, 1917, Allen Dulles would find himself back in Europe. And he would end up getting stationed in Bern, Switzerland, where he'd be gathering information on Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Balkans. On November 15, 1917, patriarch of the family, John Watson Foster, would pass away overnight. On January 2, 1918, we see Mrs. John Foster Dulles has been staying with the Secretary of State and Mrs. Lansing for the last month, and is heading back to Auburn, New York to spend the winter, while Captain Dulles is on duty here at the War College. 6 days later, on January 8, 1918, we see Miss Natalie Dulles has returned to Washington from Auburn, New York, where she spent the holidays, and is with Mrs. John W. Foster and the Secretary of State and Mrs. Lansing for the remainder of the winter. On February 12, 1918, a month after leaving Washington, we see Mrs. John Foster Dulles has arrived in Washington from Auburn, New York, to visit the Secretary of State and Mrs. Lansing for a month. Her husband, Captain Dulles, U.S.A., who is on duty in Washington, has been staying with the Secretary and Mrs. Lansing for the greater part of the winter. On November 26, 1918, we see Mrs. Lansing's sister, Mrs. A.M. Dulles, will arrive from Auburn, New York tomorrow to spend Thanksgiving with Secretary and Mrs. Lansing and with her mother, Mrs. John W. Foster. Major and Mrs. John Foster Dulles are established for the winter at 1733 South Street. Major Dulles is a nephew of Mrs. Lansing and has spent much time at the home of Secretary and Mrs. Lansing since he has been on duty in Washington. With the war now being over, a month later we see Allen Dulles being assigned to the American Commission to negotiate peace in Paris, beginning in December of 1918. At the Paris Peace Conference, among the delegates and officials, we see Robert Lansing. Under the heading of Political and Diplomatic Questions, we see Mr. Allen Dulles. And below that, under the heading of Financial Questions, we see his brother, John Foster Dulles. So how about that? Both brothers are there. And throw in Robert Lansing, and it's a regular family affair. And below John Foster Dulles' name, we see Mr. Thomas W. Lamont, a partner at J.P. Morgan, who we've seen earlier in this series. On the next page, under the heading of Economic and Commercial Questions, we see Mr. Bernard M. Baruch. So this is almost shaping up like a dinner party at the Foster house. We see by late June 1919 that Colonel and Mrs. John Foster Dulles had just returned from Paris a few days earlier. Allen Dulles would stay in Europe for years in various postings while rising up in the State Department, and would be involved in many conventions, delegations, and commissions. Ultimately resigning in 1926 to join his brother Foster Dulles at Sullivan and Cromwell. And he would also be a director at the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation and Schroeder Trust Company. And keep that in mind as we'll be revisiting that again. So as we've seen so far, this is quite the extraordinary family, who also enjoy quite the celebrity status as we've seen. And it's into this world of wealth and prestige that the two brothers grew up in. And although we've only just got into the 1920s, the brothers have already hit the world stage with their participation at the Paris Peace Conference. And now we'll take a look at the 1920s and 30s and their work for Sullivan and Cromwell, formed in 1879 and situated in the Drexel Building, which was owned by Anthony Drexel and J.P. Morgan Jr., which we looked at in the very first episode of this series. Already well connected and doing good, it was after Sullivan's death in 1887 that Cromwell started to take in new partners, the first three being William J. Curtis, Alfred Jaretsky, and Royal Victor. And then things really started to take off, as coming out of the 1800s into the early 1900s, William Nelson Cromwell was instrumental in creating the deal that would see the United States owning the Panama Canal for almost 100 years. From the book A Law Unto Itself, the untold story of the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, we see the Paris-based New Panama Canal Company hired Cromwell. And if you watched Part 2, Chapter 2 of this series, Smedley Butler and the White House Plot, then you'll know we've gone over a bunch of this already. And the Paris-based New Panama Canal Company was actually owned by J.P. Morgan and a consortium of his rich elite friends. And remember, as we saw, it was decades later in 1977 where we learn it was Cromwell, sitting in the White House itself, who wrote Teddy Roosevelt's dispatches and orders and engineered the entire operation. And also remember it was Smedley Butler who they sent down to enforce it and make sure everything went through. And we also see that Cromwell was appointed Panama's general counsel and fiscal agent. And he would share the latter position with the Sullivan and Cromwell landlord, J.P. Morgan and Company, of course. All of these events really put Sullivan and Cromwell on the map. And though they happened a few years before Foster Dulles would join Sullivan and Cromwell, he would have plenty of involvement with South and Central America in his early days with the firm. Going back to the book, A Law Unto Itself, we see Roger L. Farnham, who used to work at Sullivan and Cromwell, would go on to become vice president of National City Bank and the president of the Haiti Railroad, which of course was a Sullivan and Cromwell client, and he was also the vice president of the National Bank of Haiti. And again, remember from the Smedley Butler episode, in 1914 the U.S. Marines were sent back into Haiti, and they marched into the Haitian National Bank, and they marched out with $500,000 worth of gold to take back to the National City Bank in New York, today known as Citibank. And back in those days, the bank was being run by longtime president and chairman James Stillman, and their biggest client was John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which makes sense when you consider that James Stillman's daughter, Isabel Goodrich Stillman, would marry William Rockefeller's son, Percy Rockefeller, while James Stillman's other daughter, Sarah Elizabeth Stillman, would marry William Rockefeller's other son, William Goodsell Rockefeller. And of course, William Rockefeller's daughter, Geraldine Rockefeller, would marry Marcellus Hartley Dodge Sr., bringing the Remington Arms Company into the family. And while we're looking at weddings and connections, we see that when Prescott Bush married Dorothy Walker, one of Dorothy Walker's bridesmaids was Isabel Rockefeller, who's the daughter of Percy Rockefeller. And Prescott Bush's brother, James Bush, was his best man. And we see Prescott Bush's classmate, Knight Woolley, was one of the ushers, or groomsmen, as was Dorothy Walker's brother, George Herbert Walker Jr. And it's interesting that all of these guys here are graduates of Skull and Bones. But anyways, I just wanted to show a small example of how all these elites can be connected through marriage. And it's in this world of elites that Foster and Allen Dulles grew up with, mingled with, and worked with. Anyways, Foster Dulles was rapidly climbing the ladder at Sullivan and Cromwell during these years, and we can see that even a major company like United Fruit would learn not to go against Foster Dulles and Sullivan and Cromwell. Foster Dulles even put Cromwell in his debt when the United Fruit Company and a New York banker tried to get Panama to remove Cromwell as the country's fiscal agent. And of course that didn't work out too well for them. So in a case of, if you can't beat them, you might as well join them, we see that by 1936, John Foster Dulles is setting up deals for his client, United Fruit Company. The relationships between Foster Dulles and Sullivan and Cromwell and the U.S. State Department certainly helped both Foster Dulles and Sullivan and Cromwell's rise in power. And here we can see an example of those relationships working together in 1917. Now Secretary of State, Lansing recruited Dulles to go to Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama on the pretext of firm business, but really to find out which leaders would support the United States against the Germans. Dulles was cruising to Central America, playing bridge and listening to the wireless, when on April 6, 1917, he heard America's declaration of war on Germany. So there's an example of Foster Dulles using his position in Sullivan and Cromwell, but secretly working for the State Department, basically like a spy. And now let's have a look at some of the events that happened just a few months earlier in Cuba, which was on the verge of a civil war stemming from the November 1916 elections. And again from Stephen Kinzer, who wrote the book, The Brothers.
Foster Dulles was sent off on another assignment, very typical for Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell represented most of the American businesses that were active in Cuba. Their clients controlled most of the sugar plantations in Cuba, nearly all of the rail lines, the cement company, and most of the economic investment in Cuba. An election was held, and the Conservative Party which had always bowed down in front of American power, was defeated, not surprisingly. The Liberal Party won on a platform we are going to restrict through taxes and tariffs the ability of American companies to function freely in Cuba so we can build up a domestic industry and domestic agriculture. Well, this was horrifying to these companies. And they were, as I said, already represented by Sullivan and Cromwell. Sullivan and Cromwell existed to prevent damage to giant American corporations. So John Foster Dulles was given this job. It could have been given to other lawyers, but he was chosen because he had already shown in a number of other assignments his skill at this kind of manipulation. The very next day, John Foster Dulles got on the train in Penn Station. He came to Washington, D.C. He went to see Uncle Bert, otherwise known as Secretary of State Lansing. He told Uncle Bert, we need to send 2 warships to Cuba, one for the northern part of the island where the rebels are active, and one on the southern part, and we got to land Marines there, and we got to put down the liberals who have won the election and make sure the conservatives who have lost the election can stay in power. The next day, those warships were sent. 6,000 Marines landed in Cuba. They crushed the liberal protests and remained occupying Cuba for the next 6 years. That was the kind of work that John Foster Dulles did as a private lawyer.
So Foster Dulles and Sullivan and Cromwell were able to build a large power base in the Caribbean and South America in the 1910s and 1920s, and in a lot of cases with the official backing of Washington. And then in the 1920s and 1930s, attention began to turn across the Atlantic Ocean. And as we've seen in the first 3 chapters of Part 2 of this series, there were about to be massive deals to be made abroad, involving mega corporations, that would then lead to the rise of Nazi Germany. And the Dulles brothers and Sullivan and Cromwell were very much in the fray of it all as well. In May of 1924, under the heading of clients of Sullivan and Cromwell, we see who a few of their clients are at that time, and 10 others. And under directorships of firm members, the members of the firm of Sullivan and Cromwell are officers or directors in at least 40 corporations. The firm members through whom these interlocking directorships are established are, and there we see John Foster Dulles' name. In October of 1924, we see the Dawes Plan is going through. And in essence, it's a plan to allow the United States to lend hundreds of millions of dollars to Germany to help rebuild. A plan John Foster Dulles supported and helped to draft. Then a couple months later, on December 15, 1924, through the Dawes Plan, we see the first loan of $10 million going to Friedrich Krupp, subject to the approval of Mr. Sullivan and Cromwell of New York. And if you'll remember from the last episode, Empire of Evil, Krupp AG was one of those German industrial giants that was instrumental in the rise of Nazi Germany. And Sullivan and Cromwell and John Foster Dulles were instrumental in the rebuilding of Krupp AG after World War I. A couple of years later, in September of 1926, Allen Dulles would quit the State Department, and then he would join his brother at Sullivan and Cromwell. Again, looking back to the Empire of Evil episode of this series, we saw Fritz Thyssen, who I thought was pronounced Fritz Thyssen, but it's pronounced Thyssen, and he was a major financer of Hitler in the early days leading up to the war, and even wrote a book, I Paid Hitler. And now let's have a listen to John Loftus, a former Justice Department prosecutor in the Office of Special Investigations, who charged and deported Nazi war criminals in the United States, and also co-authored the book Unholy Trinity.
One of the reasons that Thyssen got away with it was that he had a very good lawyer, and his lawyer was Allen Dulles. Now, Allen Dulles was in charge of U.S. intelligence investigations in Germany after the war. It was very convenient, because Allen Dulles was also the lawyer for the Thyssens, and also the lawyer for the Bushes. The law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell, to which Allen Dulles and his brother belonged, was actually the law firm that handled most of these bank transactions and set up the companies. They were the people who helped direct American investment in Germany during the 20s and 30s. And now it was up to the Dulles brothers to help their clients get their money back. In particular, the Rockefellers had a huge chunk of money in Brown Brothers Harriman, which the Bushes had invested in the Thyssen Empire. And the Rockefellers had no sense of humor about going broke. They wanted their money back.
And there's some familiar names we've seen a lot of in this series, like the Rockefellers. But he's not talking about these Rockefellers, he's talking about the generations that followed. And he also mentioned the Bushes, and by that he's referring to Prescott Bush and his father-in-law, George Herbert Walker, who were both integral pieces and partners in the Harriman Empire. And remember, in the Prescott Bush episode of this series, we saw an article by The Guardian talking about how Brown Brothers Harriman partner, Knight Woolley, wrote to Averell Harriman warning about problems with the Consolidated Silesian Steel Corporation, as Poland at that time was trying to nationalize it. And I've found a copy of that letter, dated January 20th, 1933, where Knight Woolley writes to Averell Harriman, "The Consolidated Steel situation has become increasingly complicated, and I have accordingly brought in Sullivan and Cromwell in order to be sure that our interests are protected." After studying the situation, Foster Dulles is insisting that their man in Berlin get into the picture and obtain the information which the directors here should have. You will recall that Foster is a director, and he is particularly anxious to be certain that there is no liability attaching to the American directors. And on the second page of the document we see, Foster is also calling a directors' meeting, as there has been none for many months. So Foster Dulles was a director in the Consolidated Silesian Steel Corporation, which would go on to be seized in 1942 under the Trading with the Enemy laws, when they started seizing a whole bunch of Brown Brothers Harriman interests. And as we can see from most of the dates here, October and November of 1942, long after the United States had entered the war, Brown Brothers Harriman still had interests in these Nazi Germany-related companies. And even after the war, they were still seizing Nazi-related companies, with Brown Brothers Harriman interests involved. And remember what John Loftus said about Allen Dulles after the war.
Now, Allen Dulles was in charge of U.S. intelligence investigations in Germany after the war. It was very convenient, because Allen Dulles was also the lawyer for the Thyssen's, and also the lawyer for the Bushes.
Now let's have a look at this article from September of 1944, in the last year of World War II. And we can see John Foster Dulles, in the spring of 1939, was still defending the dictator nations, and by that they're meaning Germany, Italy, and Japan. For more than 10 years, Dulles and his law firm Sullivan and Cromwell had been trying to salvage some of the cash, which they had poured into Germany since the 1920s. And remember, this is 1944, so they're saying this started more than 10 years earlier, in 1933 as we'll see, which is right in the thick of the Great Depression. And this is also part of what John Loftus was talking about when he said the Rockefellers wanted their money back. It was the stock market crash of October 1929 that triggered the Great Depression. And here we can see even up until 1930, Dulles continued optimistic about American investments in Germany. Germany has made great progress under the Dawes Plan, he said on October 21st, 1930. Her national income and government income have grown to a point where the reparations charge constitutes a readily bearable percentage. But of course that didn't work out, and an economic world collapse was underway. And by 1933, Foster Dulles was retained by Brown Brothers Harriman to go to Berlin and try to salvage something out of the chaotic wreckage. Here they talk about the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, and say that Allen Dulles is the director of both J. Henry Schroeder and the Schroeder Trust Company, and the affairs of this international banking house are intimately tied up with the Dulles law firm, which would be Sullivan and Cromwell. So, the J. Schroeder Bank was started by Johann Heinrich Schroeder, who took over his father's trading company in the early 1800s, and he opened branches in London and New York among other places. And it's the New York branches that Allen Dulles becomes the director of in 1937, at which point is being run by Baron Rudolf Bruno Schroeder. Whether the Dulles brothers knew it or not, it was a member of this banking house, Baron von Schroeder, who financed Hitler. That was on January 4th, 1933. And we see that meeting being reported in this January 6, 1933 article. And of course, by the end of the month, Adolf Hitler was Chancellor of Germany. And now let's have a look at the Schroeder banking family and how they connect. And it's Baron Rudolf Bruno Schroeder who's running the family business during World War I and up to his death in 1940. And from a modern-day Schroeder's pamphlet, we see Rudolf Bruno Schroeder was a Hamburg-born nephew of John Henry. And John Henry was born Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Schroeder, who was the son of Baron Johann Heinrich Schroeder, who founded the company. And Baron Johann Heinrich Schroeder had 14 children in total. And Baron Rudolf Bruno Schroeder and Baron Kurt von Schroeder were the children of Baron Johann Heinrich Schroeder's other sons, making him their grandfather. And Johann Heinrich Wilhelm Schroeder, their uncle, who died in 1910, paving the way for Rudolf Bruno Schroeder to take over the family business. Schroeder's goes on to tell us, after World War I, Rudolf Bruno Schroeder provided financing to support the reconstruction of Germany, and also became a sought-after advisor in Austria. Now let's have a look at this thesis by Jonathan Marshall, published by Cornell University in 1980. Schroeder banking affiliates brought together American, British, and German capital. They included the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation of New York and a subsidiary trust company, the J. Henry Schroeder and Company in London, Schroeder, Gebruder and Company of Hamburg, and the J. H. Stein Bank of Cologne. This close circle also attracted two allied law firms, Sullivan and Cromwell of New York and Albert and Westrick of Berlin. At the center of this group lay the family's London Bank, founded in 1804 as a merchant bank by Johann Heinrich von Schroeder. And it stayed a merchant bank for decades until Johann Heinrich Schroeder refounded it in the 1870s. And below we see it was Baron Rudolf Bruno Schroeder who in 1923 established the New York branch, which would also include the trust company that went along with it. And in 1934, the J. Henry Schroeder Trust Company of New York became the agent for Germany's central banker Hjalmar Schacht's scheme to retire the German debt. And Hjalmar Schacht was Hitler's Reich Minister of Economics starting in 1934. And he was also a very influential part of a group that would rally German industry behind the Nazis' rise to power. Meanwhile, in Germany itself, cousins of Bruno von Schroeder also ran banks in the family network, and mentioned as Baron George von Schroeder of Hamburg, but more important was another cousin, Kurt, who owned and managed the J. H. Stein Bank of Cologne. Relations between the three remained close, and after 1919, the three banks then became correspondents for each other. Between 1923 and 1939, Kurt traveled frequently to London to see his cousin since J. Henry Schroeder and Company was his major British client. Baron Kurt von Schroeder enjoys the dubious distinction of having been one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most generous supporters. In later years, Schroeder became one of the leading private financial backers of Heinrich Himmler. He and other friends of Himmler contributed some million marks every year to Himmler's slush fund. Himmler appointed Schroeder an SS brigadier general. After the war, a denazification court in the British zone sentenced Schroeder to only 3 months' imprisonment and a small fine. At a second trial, however, he received 1 year in prison and a fine of 500,000 Deutschmarks. Among the industrial contributors to Himmler's special fund were 2 German subsidiaries of International Telephone and Telegraph, or what we call today ITT. And running all of the Germany properties was Gerhard Westrick. and Westrick's chief occupation was the law, with his law partner Dr. Heinrich Albert. And remember, Albert and Westrick was one of the two law firms, along with Sullivan and Cromwell, that were working with this network of Schroeder banking institutions. And if Dr. Heinrich Albert sounds familiar to you, it's because we had an in-depth look into him already earlier in this series. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But Albert and Westrick was also the legal representative in Germany of Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm of John Foster and Allen Dulles. Immediately following World War I, Foster represented a German businessman who sought to recover assets seized by the alien property custodian, and this plunged Dulles into a scandal, but he escaped with his reputation untainted. And here's another scandal he was involved in that had its roots in the 1929 Wall Street crash, and then an investigation in 1937 by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which then led to a lawsuit against Foster Dulles at this point in time, 1944. In fact, even today, Dulles is being hounded by disagreeable lawyers who demand his deposition in one of the most suspicious-looking cases in the history of American utility companies. For months, Dulles dodged the process server in this case. Finally, a marshal waited all night in front of Dulles' house, and he was served a subpoena. Several photographers were present, caught the dramatic picture, but for some reason, the photograph was never published. First chapter in this case occurred when Harrison Williams organized the North American Holding Company, controlling a score of Midwest utilities with securities valued at $1.5 billion in 1929. John Dulles was not only counsel, but in the peak year of 1929 became a director and a member of the executive committee. And in 1937, the SEC started investigating how Harrison Williams turned a $2 million investment into a $680 million investment in only 18 months leading up to the stock market crash. So John Foster Dulles remained there for 9 years until suddenly on November 4th, 1938, he resigned. His resignation followed a phone call from the Securities and Exchange Commission that it intended to investigate the operations of North America's most important subsidiary, Union Electric of Missouri. Government prosecutors put John Dulles on the witness stand and grilled him at great length, but did not indict him. They did indict and convict Frank J. Boehm, Executive Vice President of Union Electric. Boehm has now turned around and sued John Dulles, Harrison Williams, Clarence Dillon, and their companies. This is the suit in which Mr. Dulles is now such a reluctant witness. And a little bit about Harrison Williams. In World War I, he worked with Bernard Baruch and John Foster Dulles, who served as his attorney throughout his business career. So how do you think this turns out? Anyways, going back to the Schroeders and the Dulleses. John Foster Dulles and his law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, represented Verhenite Stahlwerk, the Thyssen-Flick Steel and Coal Trust, I.G. Farben's American subsidiary General Dyestuffs, Robert Bosch, and other large German corporations. One of Sullivan and Cromwell's most prominent clients was the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, on whose board sat Allen Dulles, and he would join them in 1937. Now let's have a look at a few articles that were originally published between 1946 and 1948 that the CIA decided in the 1950s to keep classified for the next 50 years until 2005. And this article is from 1947, and they tell us about Allen Dulles being the director of the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation and the Schroeder Trust Company, and that Baron Bruno von Schroeder and Baron Kurt von Schroeder are first cousins. The Schroeder Banking Institution in London opened its offices in or about 1874 by joining forces with the famous Tearks family. And what they mean there is around 1874 Schroeders went from a merchant bank to a commercial bank. And the Tearks family were heavily involved in the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which means that by joining together, the Schroeder banking house was now also involved with the Anglo-Persian Oil Company, which will have major ramifications in the decades to come, as we'll see. The man who guided the destiny of the J. Henry Schroeder Company throughout World War I was Baron Bruno von Schroeder, while his cousin Baron Kurt von Schroeder was the midwife of Nazism, the man who brought Hitler and von Papen together in his house in 1932, as we saw. When Britain declared war on Germany on August 4, 1914, Baron Rudolf Bruno Schroeder knew his German nationality would be a problem, so he used his political and financial connections to get him British citizenship. And as we can see here, in November of 1914, the question was raised in the House of Commons, but we can see by then Baron Bruno Schroeder, the banker, was already naturalized on August 7th, 3 days after Britain's declaration of war. It was Baron Bruno von Schroeder speaking in his own name and in the name of his colleagues of Britain's financial fraternity who approved all the moves of his cousin Kurt, which ultimately led to the appointment of Hitler as Chancellor of Germany in 1933. Here they're looking at the ownership of Schroeder's, but after 1929, the secret of the real ownership of all Schroeder interests in both Britain and the US is closely guarded in London, since under British law, British nominees are protected and the true ownership of bearer shares may never be divulged. After World War I, the Dulles' law firm, Sullivan and Cromwell, became the American legal advisor to American big business operating in Germany. Moreover, the firm handled the most important loans granted by American banks to Germany after World War I. These loans involved many hundreds of millions of dollars. They helped Germany to recover from its defeat after World War I by rebuilding and modernizing her industries. Needless to add, these loans were never repaid by Germany. And keep in mind, this is from 1947. Loans of such magnitude involved tremendous work and necessitated a close contact with influential circles in Berlin. The law firm of Albert and Westrick was at that time very influential in Germany. The firm became the counterpart in Berlin of Sullivan and Cromwell in New York. And there's Dr. Heinrich Albert again. And they give a bit of a history on him, which we saw in the Empire of Evil episode of the series. Where in 1915, not 1917, Heinrich Albert showed up in New York and nobody knew why. But after government agents got a hold of his briefcase containing documents and his correspondence, it was clear that he was in the United States for purposes of espionage and propaganda. He would go on to do work for Ford Work in the 1920s, and then became a director in 1930 and chairman of the board in 1937. And he would run Ford Work for the Nazis during World War II. And he was also the legal counsel for all of these companies in Germany in the 1930s. And this is who the Albert is in Albert and Westrick, who were the counterparts in Berlin of Sullivan and Cromwell, who by this point is being run by Foster Dulles. Now let's have a deeper look into Baron Kurt von Schroeder from this 1948 article. And they're talking about his trial in November of 1947, where he only got 3 months in jail and a 1,500 Reichsmark fine. Here we can see the outrageous judgment was handed down by a German denazification court. And out of 33 prosecutors of this denazification court, not less than 30 were former members of the Nazi Party. The question should be asked why von Schroeder was allowed to escape Allied justice. The article then goes on to list a bunch of Baron Kurt von Schroeder's history, stating Kurt von Schroeder was a brigade leader of the Nazi SS. He was a member of the Death Head Ring and of the Honorary Knife of the SS. Von Schroeder was the brains and organizer of the Circle of Friends, and he was chief advisor of the Circle of Friends as well. And as we've seen a few times in this series, the Circle of Friends are the Friends of Himmler, and entities in this circle included I.G. Farben, Hamburg American Shipping Lines, which tie into Avril Harriman and Prescott Bush, and we see Deutsche Bank there as well. Anyways, they remind us that it was von Schroeder who brought the war criminal Franz von Papen together with Hitler in 1932. In the later 1930s and into World War II, Von Schroeder would take over all kinds of properties of people who fled Nazi Germany. He would take over all kinds of properties in Holland as well, including Queen Wilhelmina's properties and the properties of 10 of her ministers. Von Schroeder prevailed upon Hitler to allow him to control the extensive properties in Holland of the early Nazi supporter and German trustee, Fritz Thyssen. He would also take possession of a lot of foreign properties located in Germany, and these were industrial properties. Kurt von Schroeder's international banking connections can be seen from the fact that he is the first cousin to the notorious Bruno von Schroeder, late head of the J. Henry Schroeder Bank of London. The J. Henry Schroeder Bank of London, in turn, has the following subsidiaries in the United States: the Schroeder Trust Company and the J. Henry Schroeder Banking Corporation, both in New York. And by 1937, Allen Dulles would be a director on both of those entities. Von Schroeder was the Führer of all the private banks in Germany during World War II. And we can see here this began in January of 1938, when von Schroeder took over as president of the Reichsbank from Hjalmar Schacht. And Hjalmar Schacht, who was the longtime Reichsbank president since 1923, would also be appointed by Hitler as Nazi Germany's Reich Minister of Economics in 1934. And that would be an appointment that John Foster Dulles would celebrate by hooking up the Nazis with Inco, the International Nickel Company, at the time the world's leading nickel producer from Sudbury, Canada. And just to point out here as well, that Hjalmar Schacht was also one of the group of leading German industrialists and economists that facilitated and paved the way for Hitler's rise to power, a group that included I.G. Farben. And if you watched the previous episode of this series, Empire of Evil, remember what we looked into in Chapter 7. We saw I.G. Farben had its tentacles intertwined with all kinds of the leading American industrialists, leading some even to treasonous actions, like on the part of Standard Oil, for example, when they withheld synthetic rubber patents from the United States after entering World War II. Anyways, we can see that John Foster Dulles was also doing his part in helping I.G. Farben in the 1930s. He spent many hours in the 1930s negotiating with I.G. Farben officials in his New York office. Sullivan and Cromwell represented I.G. Farben's biggest subsidiary in the Western Hemisphere, the General Aniline and Film Corporation, which was originally the American I.G. Corporation. And again, this is something we looked into in the Empire of Evil episode. And these are some of the members of the board of directors and bankers associated with it. And now we learn that Sullivan and Cromwell, and by extension the Dulles brothers, were doing their legal work. Still, as part of his responsibilities at Sullivan and Cromwell, Allen Dulles continued to do business with the Germans. In 1937 he joined the board of directors of J. Henry Schroeder Bank, the American subsidiary of the London Bank that Time magazine in 1939 called, quote, an economic booster of the Rome-Berlin axis, end quote. So as we can see, the Dulles brothers were working right alongside so many others who were instrumental in Nazi Germany's rise to power. But now, of course, with World War II underway and the United States entering it in December of 1941, would see Allen Dulles re-emerge in a new entity and forerunner to what would become the C.I.A., the O.S.S., the Office of Strategic Services. The O.S.S. was officially created by President Franklin D. Roosevelt on June 13, 1942, by executive order, and he chose William J. Donovan to lead it. Allen Dulles would be the station chief based out of Bern, Switzerland during World War II, the same place he worked for the State Department during World War I. Here's an official exhibition catalog of the O.S.S. you can find online that gives a little bit of history about the O.S.S. And in it we can see that William Donovan's top 4 officers each have a page of their own. And they would be Allen Dulles, William Colby, William Casey, and Richard Helms. And it's interesting to see that these top 4 guys of the O.S.S. would go on to lead the C.I.A. in the decades that would follow. Now remember the circle of friends, or the friends of Himmler. We see that Karl Wolff, who was Heinrich Himmler's top assistant and a leader of the SS, was also a leader of the circle of friends. And in the final days of the war, Allen Dulles would meet with Karl Wolff to arrange the surrender of Nazi forces in Italy, where Wolff had been placed in charge. You can read a little bit about it from an article written by Allen Dulles himself in Harper's Magazine in 1966. Essentially, they arranged a surrender at the end of April 1945, when everybody but perhaps Hitler knew the war was already over. And while the Allies were storming through Germany and closing in on Berlin, not much was happening in Italy under Wolff's control. But he thought a major offensive by the Allies on him was imminent, and set about his plans to surrender, which was arranged by Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles and supporters of him would always say that this saved a lot of lives, as it avoided more battles. But the reality is that the lives saved were that of Wolff's and the Nazis under his command. Here's Karl Wolff's surrender by proxy dated April 25, 1945. Hitler would be dead in 5 days and the war in Europe would be over shortly after. Karl Wolff's actions of surrendering at the last minute was a way to get leniency for himself and his commanders when the eventual trials he knew he would have to face began. And that's exactly what happened, at first, and Allen Dulles helped facilitate that. Eventually though, Karl Wolff would be charged again a few times, and ultimately be sentenced to 15 years in jail in 1964 for his role in deporting 300,000 Polish Jews to the Treblinka extermination camp to be slaughtered. Going back to Allen Dulles' article that he wrote for Harper's Magazine, we see this. I did not learn until some time later that before he left, Wolff gave Pirelli a kind of personal testament addressed to me. These were its contents. So this is a letter now from Karl Wolff to Allen Dulles, and he wrote, "If after my death my honor be assailed, I request Mr. Dulles to rehabilitate my name, publicizing my true, humane intentions." And it's pretty interesting to see that the relationship between top Nazi Karl Wolff and Allen Dulles was such that Wolff would have no problems asking these requests of Dulles. Rehabilitate his name? Publicize his true, humane intentions? In other words, hey Allen, if I die, please lie through your teeth about me. With the war in Europe now over, and the war in the Pacific coming to its conclusion in the months following, we'll fast forward to 1947. And under President Harry Truman, we would see the creation of the National Security Act, which in turn created the CIA. We can see here from the Act, There was hereby established under the National Security Council a Central Intelligence Agency with the Director of Central Intelligence. After the war, Mr. Dulles returned to New York to practice law. Before long, he was helping to draft the legislation to set up the Central Intelligence Agency, and a year later he headed a committee to report on the effectiveness of the agency. So Allen Dulles was involved in the creation of the CIA right from the beginning. And here's a couple letters he wrote during his time back at Sullivan and Cromwell after the war. In 1950, the CIA's Director General Walter Bedell Smith invited Mr. Dulles to Washington. Mr. Dulles stayed for 11 years, first as Deputy Director, then as Director, and actually for the first number of months he was a consultant. And we can see here on this January 7, 1951 article on the relatively new CIA Director Walter Bedell Smith, that he persuaded Allen Dulles to leave his job at Sullivan and Cromwell and join the CIA as a top consultant. Now let's hear from Stephen Kinzer again.
They spent their whole adult lives, essentially, working to defend the right of large American corporations to operate freely in other countries. And they developed all kinds of methods to be sure that small countries would not obstruct the ability of their clients to earn great profits. Now, in the early 1950s, Sullivan and Cromwell, and in particular the Dulles brothers, suffered two terrible and most unaccustomed defeats. They were sworn above all to protect and defend the interests of their clients. Once a big multinational corporation has hired the Dulles brothers, those corporations are safe. The Dulles brothers will defend them. That's the reason those companies hired the Dulles brothers, and that worked for decades. In 1951, the Dulles brothers suffered two shocks. First of all, the elected Prime Minister of Iran, with the approval of the unanimous vote of the Parliament of Iran, nationalized the Iranian oil industry. That industry was controlled by a British company, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and that oil company's financial agent, its bank, was something called the Schroeder Bank, which was one of the biggest international banks at that time. The Schroeder Bank was a client of the Dulles brothers. And in fact, Allen Dulles actually sat on the board of directors of the Schroeder Bank. So the Schroeder Bank had hired him to be sure that its interests in Iran were safe. And what happened? Its interests in Iran were attacked and virtually liquidated by Prime Minister Mossadegh in Iran. They were not able to protect their client. This had never happened to them before.
Going back and having a look at Iran. On April 28, 1951, we see the lower house of Parliament today ask Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to appoint Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh as the country's new premier. The surprise move came in a heated campaign to take over the British-owned Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And after 2 months of failed negotiations, on June 20th, 1951, Premier Mossadegh would order the complete seizure of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company.
Soon thereafter, in tiny Guatemala, also with the approval of the elected Congress of Guatemala, the government under President Jacobo Arbenz passed a land reform law. Under this land reform law, if you had a very large amount of land, and you weren't using most of it, you had to sell that land to the government. And that unused land would then be cut up into small pieces and distributed out to peasants. The biggest landowner in Guatemala was the United Fruit Company. And the United Fruit Company was a principal client of Sullivan and Cromwell. United Fruit also secured its hold over Guatemala through two other companies. They owned IRCA, the International Railroads of Central America, that controlled the whole rail system of Guatemala. And they also owned the electric company that generated all of Guatemala's electricity. All three of those companies were clients of the Dulles brothers. And their financial agent was, surprise, the Schroeder Bank. So this meant that the Dulles brothers had also failed the United Fruit Company. For decades, they had been able to assure a steady flow of profits for the United Fruit Company and for themselves, since they were both stockholders in the fruit company.
Looking into the CIA's file on Operation PB Success, which was the code name for the CIA's operation to remove Arbenz from power, which started out as Operation PB Fortune, they have a timeline of events. And we see on November 11th, 1950, Jacobo Arbenz gets elected as president of Guatemala. The following summer, on August 22nd, 1951, the United Fruit Company threatens that if labor costs rise, they'll close operations in Guatemala. And 2 days later, on August 24th, we see Allen Dulles becomes the CIA's deputy director. So that's good timing. A month later, a storm wipes out United Fruit's most important production fields. Over the rest of 1951 and into 1952, we see United Fruit and the Guatemalan government battling away. Between January of 1952 and March of 1952, some sort of activities took place, but to this day those activities remain classified. March 25, 1952, Mexico City, redacted, begins receiving weekly reports from Castillo Armas. And I'll speculate that the redacted part has something to do with the CIA, and Castillo Armas is eventually going to be the next dictator of Guatemala. June 16, 1952, case officer redacted arrives in Guatemala, and no doubt the case officer is from the CIA. And it's on June 17, 1952, that Arbenz enacts the Agrarian Reform Law, and that's the land reform laws that Stephen Kinzer was talking about. The next month, on July 10, 1952, we see Deputy Director of Plans Allen Dulles meets with Mann to solicit State Department approval for plan to overthrow Arbenz. And the next month, on August 18, 1952, DCI gives approval for PB Fortune, which is the forerunner for Operation PB Success. So CIA operations against Arbenz are now underway in Guatemala. And now let's go back to Iran. 5 months later, in January of 1953. And we see it's been 18 months since Iran seized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and they seem to be doing quite fine, despite predictions. But it's January of 1953, and a new U.S. administration is coming in, one led by former World War II General Dwight Ike Eisenhower. And this included Richard Nixon as Vice President and John Foster Dulles as Secretary of State. And a month later, in February, we see Allen Dulles is confirmed as the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. So now, for the first time in U.S. history, you have one brother in charge of the overt policies and relations with other countries, while the other brother is in charge of the covert actions inside other countries. And it's these particular brothers, who grew up among the giants of industry and the creators of the military-industrial complex, and had an uncle and grandfather who were both Secretary of State, one involved in the overthrow of the Hawaiian Monarchy, and the other involved in the lies of the Lusitania. What could go wrong? 6 weeks after becoming director of the CIA, we see on April 6, 1953, the sum of some redacted amount of money was approved for Project TP-Ajax under this date by Mr. Dulles and Mr. Wisner. And Operation TP-Ajax was the CIA's code name for the plans to overthrow Mossadegh. And 4 months later, in August of 1953, chaos would engulf Iran for a couple of days, and the Shah would flee the country after a failed coup attempt against Mossadegh. In amongst the chaos, the CIA's Kermit Roosevelt got the call to evacuate Iran, but instead he stayed and worked feverishly to organize and rally all the resources he had to hit the streets, which included the military loyal to the Shah. And within a couple of days, the Shah supporters had won, and Mossadegh was jailed. And the Shah, who had run away, returned like a triumphant hero.
It's actually been an open secret for decades, but for the first time now, the CIA has released documents that show its role in the 1953 coup. That is the coup that toppled Iran's democratically elected prime minister. Mohammad Mossadegh had moved to nationalize oil production in Iran. Well, the U.S. was concerned at the time that that would mean a victory for the Soviets in the Cold War. So shortly after his election, the CIA began to plan his overthrow, teaming up with Britain's MI6.
If you'll notice, they still fed us with what I consider to be lies, or at least misinformation.
Well, the U.S. was concerned at the time that that would mean a victory for the Soviets in the Cold War.
And while that was what they fed to the public back then, notice that the crack reporting team at CNN didn't bother to explain the relationship Allen Dulles had with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company through the Schroeder Bank. And notice they also said this.
So shortly after his election, the CIA began to plan his overthrow, teaming up with Britain's MI6.
But that's not correct. As we saw, Mossadegh was elected in April of 1951 and nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company in June of 1951. They were correct about it being a U.S.-British venture, but it wouldn't be until almost a year and a half after the election of Mossadegh, in November of 1952, that Britain would approach the U.S. about plotting the overthrow. And it was in April of 1953 that Allen Dulles approved the funding which began the operation. And what did Allen Dulles have to say about it later?
The government of Mossadegh, if you recall history, was overthrown by the action of the Shah. Now that we encouraged the Shah to take that action, I will not deny.
Well, of course he lied. The action of the Shah was to flee the country when things got tense. It was the actions of Kermit Roosevelt that would help shape the fallout in U.S.-Iran relations for the next 70 years and counting. Now let's go back to Guatemala the next year, in 1954.
Philip Rettinger was recruited from the Marines to join the CIA team.
It was explained to me that it was very important for the security of the United States that we were going to prevent a Soviet beachhead in this hemisphere, which we have heard about very recently, of course, and that the Guatemalan government was communist, and we had to do something about it.
Arbenz also embarked on a massive land reform program. Less than 3% of the landowners held more than 70% of the land. So Arbenz nationalized more than 1.5 million acres, including land owned by his own family, and turned it over to peasants. Much of that land belonged to the United Fruit Company, the giant American firm that was intent on keeping Guatemala quite literally a banana republic. United Fruit appealed to its close friends in Washington, including the Dulles brothers, who said that Arbenz was openly playing the communist game. He had to go.
This was sudden death for him. I mean, there was no chance of him winning this fight because of the fact that he had done this to the United Fruit Company, plus the fact that he was overthrowing the hegemony of the United States over this area. And this was dangerous. It could not be tolerated. We couldn't tolerate this.
From Honduras, the same country that today is the Contra staging base, the CIA launched a small band of mercenaries against Guatemala. They were easily turned back. So with its own planes and pilots, the CIA then bombed the capital. Arbenz fled and was immediately replaced by an American puppet, Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas.
He overturned all of the reformist activity of President Arbenz. He gave the land back to the United Fruit Company that had been confiscated. He took land from the peasants and gave it back to the landowners.
The CIA had called its covert action against Guatemala Operation Success.
Remember we saw in the timeline earlier that it began in 1952 under P.B. Fortune. But that was when Harry Truman was president and Allen Dulles was deputy director of the CIA and planning. Operation P.B. Success was under President Dwight Eisenhower, and by then Allen Dulles was the CIA director. And by mid-June 1954, things were flaring up on a large scale. And notice it's labeled as an anti-red revolt, meaning anti-communist or anti-Soviet. But as we can see here in the Foreign Relations of the United States, that as far back as October of 1952, the CIA knew Arbenz wasn't a communist. His personal idol was Franklin D. Roosevelt. But of course that didn't stop people like Secretary of State Foster Dulles from overhyping the Red Scare that was allegedly infiltrating the Western Hemisphere.
U.S. Secretary of State Dulles takes the rostrum to urge united action by the Americas to outlaw international communist intervention in the Western Hemisphere.
This conference was shocked by the dastardly attack on members of the United States Congress by those who professed to be patriots. They may not themselves have been communists, but they had been subjected to the inflammatory influence of communism, which avowedly uses extreme nationalism as one of its tools.
Or Henry Cabot Lodge, who was confirmed as U.S. ambassador to the United Nations on the same day that Allen Dulles was confirmed as director of the CIA.
The information available to the United States thus far strongly suggests that the situation does not involve aggression, but is a revolt of Guatemalans against Guatemalans.
And that's a lie. It wasn't Guatemalans against Guatemalans. It was CIA trained and funded and assisted Guatemalans against regular Guatemalans. And then Lodge says this to the Soviet ambassador to the United Nations.
Stay out of this hemisphere, and don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
Plans and conspiracies, he says. But the only ones acting on plans and conspiracies is the CIA. A week after Henry Cabot Lodge made those remarks at the United Nations, we see on June 25, 1954, bloody fighting rages on all fronts in Guatemala. 3 days later, Arbenz would resign and go into exile. In essence, the way the CIA trained and organized the Guatemalan rebels was very much a precursor to how they would later do the same with the Contras of the 1980s, even complete with assassination death squads. It was under Operation PB Success that we find the CIA's infamous assassination manual with many different sections. Definition: it is here used to describe the planned killing of a person who is not under the legal jurisdiction of the killer. Under deployment, they write, assassination is an extreme measure not normally used in clandestine operations. It should be assumed that it will never be ordered or authorized by any U.S. headquarters, though the latter may in rare instances agree to its execution by members of an associated foreign service. They have sections on justification and classifications. They tell us about the makeup of an assassin, planning and techniques, assassinating somebody manually, or by the use of accidents. The most efficient accident in simple assassination is a fall of 75 feet or more onto a hard surface. And with this I'm reminded of a couple of high-profile alleged suicides in the early days of the CIA. And of course, drugs. They even detail, like a football coach, a play-by-play on how a two-man team can take out a conference room full of people. Here we see Guatemala communist personnel to be disposed of, either through assassination or executive action, or imprisonment or exile. Here's a list of names of people to be disposed of, still redacted to this day, and on the left was the list of names of persons to be assassinated. Here's what Allen Dulles said about assassinations and the difference between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Do we have an application of morality in our activities they don't?
Oh, far more than they do, yes.
Could you talk on that subject?
Well, only that, as far as I know, we don't engage in assassinations and kidnappings and things of that kind. As far as I know, we never have. As far as we know, they have and done it quite consistently.
And don't try to start your plans and your conspiracies over here.
Now remember in the last chapter we met John J. McCloy, who was High Commissioner in Germany after the war, and he freed a bunch of Nazis from jail. And he became the chairman of the Council on Foreign Relations in 1953, holding that position until 1971. Meanwhile, we see that Allen Dulles had a long-time history with the Council on Foreign Relations, first as a director way back in 1937, and then he was the president from 1958 through to 1968, a 10-year overlap with John McCloy's tenure as chairman. And that makes sense as both of them were longtime Rockefeller men. And like McCloy, would also see Dulles helping ex-Nazis in the mid-1950s. Meet Nazi General Reinhard Gehlen. Here's Gehlen's military service history and his advancement under Hitler's regime. And by 1944 he was promoted to Brigadier General, and he was in charge of the armies on the Eastern Front, and he was also in charge of intelligence on the Eastern Front as well. But at the end of the war, Hitler dismissed him, as he told Hitler the war was over. And by May 27, 1945, he was an American prisoner of war, and about to cut a deal with Army intelligence, which he did. Fast forward to January of 1950, and we see, during the past 4 years, Subject, which is Reinhard Gehlen, has had a complete cover existence, with no legal records under his name. And here's his faked United States War Department ID in 1946 under the name of Hans Holbein. We are now involved in the very complex problem of legalizing him in Germany under his real name and establishing his family. And now we'll fast forward a couple of years to August of 1952, and we see former General Reinhard Gehlen, who served in Hitler's general staff as the chief of the Department of Foreign Armies, reportedly currently heads a secret organization in West Germany. And this was called the Gehlen Organization, which was unofficial and classified at the time, of course, and supposed to be under the purview of U.S. military intelligence and then the CIA. And Reinhard Gehlen wasn't supposed to hire any ex-Nazis, but of course he did, by the hundreds. Anyways, by 1954, his secret organization was secret no more, and he was vying to become leader of the official West German intelligence. Total victory for Gehlen would make him a combination J. Edgar Hoover and Allen W. Dulles wrapped into one. And Reinhard Gehlen achieved this total victory by November of 1955. And look at the picture they use. Rare photo shows Gehlen in days when he ran a spy outfit in competition with Nazi SS, like he's competing against the Nazis or something, which of course was not the case at all. He is a Nazi. And notice this rare photo they use of Heinrich Gehlen is zoomed in and cropped to not show his Nazi insignias, like the eagle holding the swastika. Reinhard Gehlen's new position meant that he now reported directly to the West German government, and not the CIA anymore. Until a few months ago, Dulles, his personal friend, paid Gehlen the dollar equivalent of £2,275,000,000 a year. And with the exchange rate of $2.8 per pound in 1955, that translates into over $6 million a year that Dulles was paying Reinhard Gehlen, on whose staff was a whole pile of ex-Nazis. Anyways, with their successes in Iran and Guatemala, for the rest of the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the CIA under Allen Dulles continued the trend of being involved in attempts to overthrow governments of other countries, either through coup attempts or assassinations. The brothers would end their time in official public duties not too far off from each other. In May of 1959, John Foster Dulles would die of cancer. And in 1961, after the Bay of Pigs disaster, President Kennedy would fire Allen Dulles as CIA director, along with Charles Cabell and Richard Bissell. President Kennedy and his officials have gone to great lengths in dealing with CIA Director Allen Dulles' impending retirement to avert any implication that his withdrawal to private life is tied to the failure of the Cuba invasion. And many feel that the CIA should be returned as quickly as possible to a purer role of intelligence collection. And remember that sentiment as we'll see it again in a minute. On November 22, 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And to this day, controversy surrounds who actually killed him, with many believing the CIA to be involved in some form. And a week after the assassination on November 29, 1963, new President Lyndon B. Johnson would appoint what would be known as the Warren Commission, charged to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy. And he would appoint Allen Dulles to the commission, the same guy President Kennedy fired as director of the CIA. And Dulles would find himself once again teamed up with his Nazi-liberating good old friend, John J. McCloy. So imagine that. These two guys, who had intimate dealings with Nazis, are on the commission investigating President Kennedy's assassination. Anyways, we'll revisit the Warren Commission in another episode of this series. In an article that the CIA deemed classified for about 40 years, that was written in the Washington Post on December 22, 1963, exactly 1 month after President Kennedy's assassination, former President Harry S. Truman, who created the CIA, would write, "Limit CIA role to intelligence. For some time I've been disturbed by the way the CIA have been diverted from its original assignment. It has become an operational and at times policy-making arm of the government. This has led to trouble and may have compounded our difficulties in several explosive areas. I never had any thought that when I set up the CIA that it would be injected into peacetime cloak and dagger operations. Some of the complications and embarrassment that I think we have experienced are part attributable to the fact that this quiet intelligence arm of the President has been so removed from its intended role that it is being interpreted as a symbol of sinister and mysterious foreign intrigue and a subject for Cold War enemy propaganda." There's another nefarious character who also had plenty of dealings with the Nazis both before and during the war that Allen Dulles was very good friends with, and that would be Prescott Bush. And most people today don't realize this, but they were very good friends for almost 40 years, until Allen Dulles' death in 1969. You can find a bunch of their letters to each other in the CIA archives. And looking at a few of them, it's quite clear that Prescott Bush had quite an influence on personnel being hired at the CIA directly through Allen Dulles. Like in this example here, Dulles is responding to Bush about a professor that Bush had previously recommended for the CIA. Here's an example of Dulles assuring Bush they have no interest in hiring a certain person that it appears Bush warned against hiring. Here's another person Bush has recommended to Dulles, and Dulles is telling him that they don't have a position at the moment, but will keep the person in mind for later possibilities. A week after that, Dulles writes to Bush again telling him he's looking into other ways the person might be able to, quote, contribute to our activities, end quote. Here's another reply from Dulles to Bush a week later about another suggestion for a person to be hired into the CIA. And here's Bush writing to Dulles with yet another suggestion. Here's Dulles thanking Bush for Bush's favorable comments about Dulles in the American Forum magazine. He tells Bush, "Your generous comments are a source of strength and encouragement to me, and I appreciate it very much." Here, Dulles is telling Bush to stop by before his trip to Latin America if he can, so Dulles can brief him. Here, Bush replies a week later saying he'll try and connect with Tracy Barnes and receive the briefing. And here's a very interesting one. Thank you very much for your letter of May 31st enclosing your son's letter about Redacted. He has a most interesting background, and I will have people in our Redacted office get in touch with him immediately. And which son of Prescott Bush do you suppose that was? Prescott Bush was Skull and Bones class of 1917, and his second oldest son, George Herbert Walker Bush, was Skull and Bones class of 1948, and his third oldest son, Jonathan James Bush, was Skull and Bones class of 1953. So my guess is that the son mentioned in the letter was either George or Jonathan, and I lean more towards Jonathan Bush. And while we're looking at the family's Skull and Bones connections, remember George Herbert Walker, Prescott's father-in-law, and the boys' grandfather, and who George Herbert Walker Bush was named after. Well, his son and grandson, both also named George Herbert Walker, were also Skull and Bones alumni as well, with George Herbert Walker Jr. from Skull and Bones class of 1927, and George Herbert Walker III was Skull and Bones class of 1953, the same year as his cousin, Jonathan James Bush. Now here's another letter I came across from way back in 1953 that I found to be very interesting, as I believe the possibility exists that underneath those redactions just might possibly contain the following words. And again, this is a letter from Allen Dulles to Prescott Bush. Dear Prez, I have your letter of 27 January 1953 with its enclosures concerning the possibility of employment for your son George. I have asked our personnel people to review George's application in light of any current vacancies, and if there are any possibilities, to arrange for an interview. However, in all frankness, I must say that the job situation here is extremely tight. As soon as we have been able to reach some determination on George's application, we shall be glad to let you know. Now, I don't know if that's what it actually says, but using the same font and spacing, it seems to fit, while making tons of sense at the same time. And at that particular point, whoever it was that Prescott Bush was trying to get hired into the CIA, Allen Dulles isn't yet the director. That won't happen for another 3 weeks. Then he can hire whoever he wants. Looking into the congressional record of Wednesday, September 6, 1961, found in the appendix, is the extension of remarks of Prescott Bush. And this comes after the failed Bay of Pigs invasion and just after Allen Dulles left the CIA into so-called retirement. though everybody knew he was fired. Also interesting is that at some point, the CIA deemed this part of the congressional record to be classified until 2003. Anyways, Prescott Bush would go on to say, "The Central Intelligence Agency is an organization of which little is really known, but from what I know of it as a member of the Committee on Armed Services, and through my personal contact with many members of that agency, I believe it has rendered outstanding service for the United States." And further he says, "I have for 30 years known Allen Dulles, director of the CIA, who occasionally comes under strong criticism. If something happens to go wrong, the blame is often placed upon him, as it was in the case of the Cuban invasion fiasco. I do not believe the blame belongs on his shoulders. I rate him a brave, dedicated, and brilliant American with a long record of distinguished service to the United States." And remember, some of that distinguished service included working with Nazis, or overthrowing democratically elected leaders of other countries, or sometimes helping to assassinate them, or training so-called freedom fighters to be, in reality, terrorist groups. That's some very distinguished stuff, and naturally Prescott Bush fully praises and supports such actions. A few weeks later, Allen Dulles would write to Prescott Bush thanking him. "Dear Pres, I was deeply touched by your kind remarks in the Senate on September 6th. I was abroad at the time and did not see them until I returned a few days ago. I also appreciated your putting into the record the excellent article from the American Legion publication." After Allen Dulles' death in 1969, Prescott Bush would write a letter to Dulles' widow, Clover Dulles, expressing his condolences. In it, he writes this: "I recall in the summer of 1961, after the ill-fated Bay of Pigs affair, you were away, and we called Allen to come for supper, and he accepted. That afternoon he called and asked if he could bring a friend, and we said surely. So he brought John McCone, whom we had known well, but had not thought of as a particular friend of Allen's. But Allen broke the ice promptly, and said, in good spirit, that he wanted us to meet his successor. The announcement came the next day. He tried to make a pleasant evening of it, but I was rather sick at heart, and angry, too, for it was the Kennedys that brought about the fiasco, and here they were making Allen seem to be the goat, which he wasn't, and did not deserve. I have never forgiven them." And that's the Kennedys, both JFK and his brother Robert Kennedy, that Prescott Bush is talking about never having forgiven them. And it appears 8 years later he's still angry about. Angry enough to include all of that in the condolence letter to Clover Dulles. Anyways, there's a good long look at the Dulles brothers and some of their family history. A history that goes all the way back to the first time the United States overthrew another government, in Hawaii, and stretches through the U.S. imperialism of the early 1900s that involved Smedley Butler, who would later speak out against it, and continued on through the 1950s and 1960s, and setting the stage for future endeavors like the Phoenix program in the Vietnam War, or Iran-Contra, and so on. It's part of why I called this episode The Gatekeepers, as the Dulles brothers most certainly bridge the gap that joins these eras together.